Hello, everybody, and welcome to our Leaders in Astrology series. Today, we are honored and privileged to speak with legendary and esteemed astrologer, author, and lecturer, Rick Levine. So, thank you so much for joining us today, and how are you doing?
I'm doing fine, but I don't want to be a legend until I'm off the Earth plane. I just want to be another human.
We
But
might have to change the word legend. Bernadette Brady, she said, let's change the legend. So we'll change that for the next interviews. Wonderful, wonderful. So thank you again so much for joining us today. And I guess I would love to start this interview by starting at the beginning of your astrological journey. So would you care to share with us where you're from, where you grew up, and how you first became interested in astrology?
yes, I was born on an island of Greece, and my father took me to Egypt, and I studied with this guy named Pythagoras. Okay, all right, it's time to get real. Um, I'm a Bronx boy, New York City born.
Hmm.
But my family had the necessity or the intelligence to get out of New York, and so I went from kindergarten through high school in what was a small town in upstate New York, about maybe not quite 200 miles north of New York City,
Hmm.
about halfway between New York and Montreal,
Wow.
a town called Saratoga Springs,
Hmm.
which is actually a very cool little town. And so I won the lottery geographically. Saratoga was a great place to grow up. It had history. It had history before the white folk got there.
Hmm.
It was the holy meeting ground, the sacred grounds of the Iroquois Five and Six Nation tribes, which was, as you may know, Benjamin Franklin modeled the U.S. government after many pieces of the Iroquois Nation.
Hmm.
And Healing Waters, and the oldest running racetrack, continuous running racetrack in the Western Hemisphere. And so there were gamblers and shady characters from New York, and Skidmore College. So it was a little college town. When I was a kid, it was an all-girls school, which wasn't a bad thing to have down the block and around the corner. And so Saratoga was a great place. And even though I was an alien in my own family,
Hmm.
um, I still had a damn good childhood. I grew up, hunting and fishing and water skiing and camping and being outside, because Saratoga is in the foothills of the Adirondack Mountains, right? Maybe about 20-minute car ride to the
Hmm.
Vermont border. And so it was cool. And it was still only, a few hours by train down to New York City.
Hmm.
And so we had family and relatives down there. And so I had the best of both worlds. And so that
Wow.
was my geographical origins, maybe more than you want to or need to know. But
So even from childhood to today, you're always on the go. You never stop moving.
I have Gemini rising and a Cancer moon,
Hmm.
and my Aries stuff tends to come off my Gemini rising, because I have four planets in Aries conjunct that are sextile to my Gemini rising,
Hmm.
and so I look busy. I have a Cancer moon. I'm a lazy slob. Well, I'm not a slob, but but I do I do chill, and I do take time off and down. But people think that I'm always on the move, and I move some, but not as much as people think.
So you try and balance that. So you've got the two elements there. So
Well, try to balance a partile Cancer moon square to an Aries sun. 16 degrees, 16 degrees. And no, I wouldn't say I try to balance. I would say that I try to live with both of those things in my being.
wow. So did you start getting interested in astrology, into astrology as through your teenage years? How did that come about? When did you first pick
Well,
up a book?
so we
Or
so we had a small city library that actually was maybe bigger than a city of that size. I mean, it was a town of like 15,000, but because there was a college there, it had a little bit more, academic lean, if you will, although I think Skidmore at that time was more of a girls' finishing school and party school than a party school for the guys who came there from the surrounding boys' schools. But I grew up spending a lot of time in the library. It was one of the ways that I could get out of the house. And it's not like I didn't have a stable family, but but on some levels, maybe it was a little bit too stable for my Uranus in the first house. But I, at an early age, I'm guessing, maybe in sixth, seventh grade, I discovered if I remember correctly, I think it was the 133 section of the Dewey Decimal System that somehow sticks in my mind. But it was the kind of stuff on psychology and mythology, and somehow that part of the library, I knew every book there, and I was particularly attracted to the work of Freud at that time. I didn't really know any better or worse, but and I'm not sure I understood what I was reading, but I read and was just fascinated by this stuff. And as I moved through my early teens, I began reading anything that I wasn't supposed to. Or let me just say things that were outside of my, school work too. And so I read a lot of fiction. I actually read a lot of historical fiction and biography and stuff like that. But I completely was enamored with science fiction. And I read a lot of science books also, nonfiction. But where the two of those met is kind of where I just fell in deep. I mean, beyond the normal sci-fi stuff, but books about psychic research and books about ghosts and UFOs and hypnotism and astrology and numerology and anything that was kind of like just a notch beyond, whether it was fiction, science fiction, or whether it was somewhere just outside the realm of what we would call nonfiction, but it wasn't really fiction. And so I became very enamored with all that stuff. And I was very strong in science and math in school. I assumed by the time I graduated from high school and went to college, I did 4 years of college right out of high school, and really assumed that I was just going to get when I went to college, I went there to be a math teacher. Actually, in particular, I was fascinated and enamored with geometry. And I wanted to be a geometry teacher. I had a cool geometry teacher in high school who was just like, I just thought like cool and really knew his stuff and brought it alive. And everyone else thought this guy was, kind of like a neat guy. And that's what I wanted to be. And it was really about 2 or 3 weeks into my college career that I dropped my math and education major and switched to psychology. And I have a BA in psychology. And it was during those years that I became first intrigued by astrology. I mean, I was in college from 1967 to 1971. I think Linda Goodman's Sun Signs came out in 66 or 67, right in there. And this was, definitely the height of the 60s. And I was at a school, the University of Stony Brook, just outside of New York, out of New York City on Long Island. And it was kind of like, it was called the Berkeley of the East. There were way too many smart radicals there. And I just became, swept up in in everything intellectual and academic
Mm.
and experiential
Mm.
about the 60s, including sex, drugs, rock and roll, and psychology, yoga, diet, nutrition, mind-altering substances.
That's a great collection there.
Well, but it was all coming through the zeitgeist if you were
Mm.
paying attention, and the school that I was at was very it was a radical school, and I mean our uh, the student activities board, which funded student activities, was very well funded, and there is not a rock and roll group from that period, with maybe the exception of the Rolling Stones, the Beatles, and Bob Dylan,
Yeah.
who I did not see in the gym there,
Mm.
typically from a reserved front row, 2, 3 rows, because I was in student government and we got reserved seating.
Wow.
And so I got a musical education that actually was part of my drug education, because at that time the two were very mixed. I drank the Kool-Aid with Jerry backstage because we had backstage passes. I took a bottle of Southern Comfort from Janis Joplin.
Oh, wow.
And I didn't know that this was like the start. Well, you're in college. This is what you do. And of course, none of these people would know me, but my experience was very much in touch with that whole period of time. And as such, astrology was a hot thing.
Mm.
And I had the luck of being involved with a woman who was very into astrology, and we kind of dug deeper together and began to look at charts. And this is really, I'm still like late teenager, 19 years old.
Mm.
But as fascinating as I think it is, I'm really into the depth psychology.
Mm.
And in particular, I was reading not only Freud, but I had access to the Bollingen translations of the complete works of Carl Jung, and people like Erich Fromm and Wilhelm Reich, and just the whole panoply of those thinkers. And on top of that, I had the privilege of hearing in small group lectures and discussions people like Alan Watts and Timothy Leary
Oh, wow.
and Ram Dass. And these were all people that just came into my life in my late teens, that I not only was reading their books, but I was hearing their lectures in person. And so it was an education that I was very privileged to get, but it had nothing to do with the coursework that I was taking.
And it sounds like all your skills and experiences through those formative years, through your psychology to your love of music, has it all kind of like concocted into the work that you produce today, the wonderful astrology that you do?
Maybe. I mean, there aren't many. Well, there are many people of my age that had some of these experiences too, but I had the privilege of attending lectures by Buckminster Fuller and Marshall McLuhan, and reading their material that many people don't even know about their work. And so, yeah, I was really lucky. And perhaps the luckiest thing that happened to me was in my senior year. Oh, and by the way, I missed out one little piece here, and that was in my high school days when I was reading all this stuff that I wasn't supposed to, because I was going down to New York on weekends and visiting relatives. So, it was a different world then. At, age 13, my parents would put me on the train, and I would get off the train in Penn Station or, in Grand Central Station in Manhattan. And then I'd work my way over to the subways, and I would take a subway and change, and I'd go out to my grandmother's and spend the weekend, but alone in New York, because in those days,
even at the age of 13, you were gallivanting around and independent and let loose.
But no one at that time, no one even thought that it wasn't something to do. It was just a very different time. And so my point here is that even in New York, I discovered bookstores that were amazing. And I would come home with these books on strange things, books like Stranger Than Science, and books by people like Charles Fort called The Book of the Damned, about, documented, things that like frogs raining from the sky and shit, crazy stuff. But in that mix, I also read a lot of stuff about people with psychic powers and telekinetic stuff, and I discovered hypnotism, and out of a book, I learned how to hypnotize people, and I discovered, geez, I can do this.
Wow.
And so I had friends that, I'm a junior in high school. I'm like 15, 16 years old, hypnotizing people, not knowing really what the hell I'm doing. But
did you manage to snap them out of it? Did they all come back?
Say that again?
Did you snap them all out of it? Did they all come back?
Yeah, a few I left. No. But there was a period of time where, at a party, it would be, Rick, hypnotize someone, and I would hypnotize the, prom king, to go over to a table and eat an onion thinking it was an apple. And I didn't know. I just, okay, this is what you do. Now, the reason why this is significant is that my senior year of college as a psychology major, I had a professor who was actually one of the early researchers in alpha wave brainwave research. And he was doing some really cool stuff with black belt martial artists and Zen masters, and kind of understanding how they could go into brainwave states almost on command. And I spent a semester hypnotizing people in his lab, and actually hypnotizing him.
Wow.
And it was kind of an interesting thing. I would go over to his home, once a week my senior year, and had this, and it was basically, I got credit for this. It was independent study stuff, but that also became a large part of what fed the work that I do. And then in my senior year, I was planning on going to the Jungian Institute and just getting a PhD in psychology and becoming a Jungian therapist, until the beginning of my senior year. Someone dropped off a book at my house and said, "Hey, I saw this book and I think you might be interested." And the name of the book, I'm looking over here because I usually have a copy of it close by, but it looks like they're on the other side of the room. But the book is a book that most astrologers would recognize. It was a book by Dan Rudhyar, called The Astrology of Personality. And I never get the subtitle right, but it's something like a reevaluation of astrology in light of 20th century psychology and philosophy. And it was basically a book about not how to do charts, but about the psychological seating of astrology, and how Jungian psychology was actually built and based upon astrology. Because, as we know, Jesus didn't call his teachings Christianity, nor did Jung call his teachings Jungian psychology. He called it analytical psychology, or the psychology of four types. The four types being thinking, feeling, sensing, intuiting, or fire, earth, air, water. The entire system he developed was built upon astrology. And I read this book and I finished it and I went, oh shit, I'm in trouble. Because it was the first time that I realized that astrology wasn't just some cool parlor game thing that worked, and how it worked, I don't know, but there was no question it worked, and I liked it and I liked doing it. And I read a book by Sidney Omar on my life in astrology, and I knew there were things called astrologers out there, but I didn't really know what they did or too much about it. And I read this book and I realized that I needed to pursue this.
So that was
incredible. The book that really A lot of astrologers get into astrology because their life is a wreck and someone left them or they get sick and they need to find meaning. No, my life was a wreck from day one, and I found astrology strictly through kind of being guided by the spirit, so to speak, into this thing that I really had no choice about. And as I really studied astrology, like many other astrologers, I never really learned astrology. I just remembered it. I mean, there was something about, as it came to me way faster and more sensible than it should have. It was like it all felt familiar. And so when I write in my bios for conferences that I've been doing astrology since I studied at the feet of Pythagoras, on some level, it's tongue in cheek, but on some level, I'm not sure that I'm kidding. I don't know.
Wow, wow. And I love that distinction that you didn't just learn astrology, you remembered it. And that's quite profound. And even something as pivotal as one book, that seemed like a pivotal moment for you at that stage. That's really quite incredible. So were there any, apart from Dane Rudier's book, and were there any other authors or astrologers that were inspirational to you as you learned more astrology?
Well, at that time, I mean, we're talking here, late 60s, early 70s. Um, there were only a handful of astrology books available. I mean, I read Isabel Hickey's, the Astrology of the Cosmic Science. I read a book by Marie Cremeri, Jean Avery, something on your rising sign. The Marie Cremeri, I think that's her name, Kumeri. That was basically about her seeing clients and stories of their charts and the clients. There was a book by Joan Quigley, who later on became Ronald Reagan and Nancy Reagan's astrologer. But at that time, and I'm thinking it was probably 1970 or 71 even, she wrote a book called Astrology for Adults. That was the first book that I had that had every planet in each sign and what it meant. I don't think there were any aspects in that book. It was just planets and signs. But at that time, that's pretty much all I was doing. I wasn't really calculating accurately full charts. I didn't have table of houses and stuff like that. But after I graduated from college, I worked in New York City for a short amount of time. I moved back to Saratoga and hung out because I didn't know what the hell I wanted to do with my life. And my hypnotist psychology professor, who was really into Zen, said that when you graduate from college, do nothing as long as you can, because once you start doing things, there won't be another time in your life when you get to do it. And so I really, whether it was a gap year or whatever, it wasn't quite that long, but I basically went home and lived at my parents' house and came and went from there. And then moved down to New York City and got a job at an ad agency. And after about 3 months of working there, I realized that if I didn't get the hell out of New York City, then I'd be stuck there the rest of my life. Right. And there was a woman in my life then who lived in Minneapolis. She was graduating from Skidmore in Saratoga, which is where I'd met her. And I moved to Minneapolis, and I've been moving west ever since.
Wow. So did you feel supported by, when you went back to your parents? Did you explain what you were doing? Were they quite supportive, or the rest of your family? How was that dynamic?
They put up with me. No, my mom kind of thought there was something to astrology, but she didn't really know what it was. And at that time, I really didn't know enough to explain it really well. And even though, I mean, I wasn't really fully studying then, but I had the bug. And my dad is a hardcore scientist, and my rest of my family just, thought, well, it's Rick. He does stuff like that, And so they kind of put up with me, thought I needed to get a real job and a real life. And I did. for years I kind of juggled astrology and something else. I was pretty lucky when I lived in Minneapolis. I got a job at a technical manufacturing company, telecommunications, but this is before computers, before cell phones, and I gravitated into sales in that small company.
Mm.
And I quickly realized I had enough of a knack that I was able to keep the manufacturing plant busy, which was what my job was in their best case scenario.
Mm.
And so they didn't care what I did or where I was, as long as they had more orders than time. And so for a couple of years, I had the ability to hang out at an astrology bookstore in Minneapolis, which was kind of a little astrology center at that time. Still is in some odd way, because Llewellyn Publications is in St. Paul, and so there's they were at that time the only, or maybe the largest and the only, occult publisher in the country.
Wow.
And so this woman owned this little bookstore called New Moon Bookstore. Carol Perkins, who has since left Earth and is traveling somewhere. And Carol was a Libra, and her bookstore basically was a social hangout for people, interested in astrology. There were no formal classes ever taught there, but from about noon every day until 10 or 11 o'clock every night, there was coffee on and a large table that sat maybe 12 to 18 people around this very large table. And there were always 2 or 3 or 4 people there sharing charts and talking astrology. And I spent a lot of time there. And it was, for me, that was like astrological boot camp. That's where I got my planetary legs, if you will. But I also read a lot. I didn't have any specific teachers then. But one of my earliest books was a book called by Michael Meyer, who was actually a student of Dane Rudhyar, called The Handbook for Humanistic Astrologers, which is still, I think, one of the most important books that I own. And it was that book, coupled with some other of Dane Rudhyar's work, that basically sent me down a path of astrological ruin, because no one ever told me that everyone didn't learn about quintiles and septiles and noviles, because that was part of Michael Meyer's book on aspects. They were just there in order. And so early on, I began looking at them, because I was never told I shouldn't, or that they were less important. And because of that, I know they're not less important, which is one of the main pieces behind my teaching these days. In fact, I'm right as we are talking and recording now. I'm 3 weeks into a 6-week course, 4 weeks of lessons, and then 2 weeks of live Zoom, being taught through Astrology Hub, called The Magic of Harmonic Aspects. And we can cycle back around to that topic later if you want to. But the other person who was very important in my early work was Grant Louis, who I became enamored with because he was pre-Dane Rudhyar, pre-psychology, and yet he really knew how to write. He was a retired English professor from, I think, Dartmouth or Colgate, maybe Dartmouth College in upstate New York. And Grant Louis's 2 most well-known books are Heaven Knows What and Astrology for the Millions, which I think is in its 30th or 40th printing. Llewellyn owns the rights on his books. And I found Grant Louis to be amazingly important and instructive. and I use some of his teachings in my teachings that I think are very, very easy to work with, and doing client work are very, very useful. And then, of course, well, I say, of course, in 1975, I'm still in Minneapolis. I attended my first astrology conference, which was the one and only conference ever sponsored by Llewellyn.
Oh, wow.
And it was called Gnosticon. Gnosticon, Gnosticon. And it was an astrology weekend that went from a Friday to a Sunday. And I lived driving distance away from it.
Wow.
And I attended all of it. And it blew my mind. I mean, because
who did you start to meet at that time? Are you still friends with some of the people at those early conferences? And
well, I know people who say they were there, but I don't remember meeting anyone other than it was the first time I had heard Noel Till lecture, and he was at the early part of his rocket ship ride, you know, kind of taking over the zeitgeist of Western astrology for a number of years. And I never, and because of my psychology orientation and his whole thing of needs hierarchy and coming from the Harvard School of Personality, he kind of like, I went to 2 of his lectures that weekend and everything just fell together and I went, holy smokes. But I also heard Isabel Hickey that weekend, and Charles Jane, who is a New York, very, very brilliant mathematician, academic astrologer. Charles Emerson, who is a Uranian astrologer. Got my first taste of Uranian astrology that weekend. There were numbers of other people that were very much a part of, you know, people that I'd either read books or heard about, that, you know, was pretty amazing. Yeah, and so life was downhill ever since.
Well, speaking of which, I wanted to switch on to your incredible body of work, and you have reached millions of people all across the world with your years and many years in astrology, from your books to your websites to 17 years, I believe, of your daily horoscope column.
Actually, I wrote something 7 days a week, 52 weeks a year for 20 and a half years.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
For 20 something. Wow.
I began writing on, I elected my first horoscope date, and something about it worked too well because I couldn't get the hell out of it. But I wrote my first horoscope column on the new moon, on the Aquarius new moon in 2002. And so it would be now 21 plus years, and I quit writing last summer.
Wow.
And I began writing them because Jeff Jower, who some people might know or remember, was a very, very wise and accomplished astrologer, was a founder of UAC and a founder of AFAN. And Jeff and I became astrology business partners in 1999 when the internet was exploding. And I, through the 90s, was kind of doing this Gemini rising dual career, which I did a lot through the late 70s, 80s, and 90s. I did quite a bit of work in the natural foods world, doing computer work, organizational work, database publishing, things of that sort. And Jeff, who had worked a few years, or worked for a bit of time for Michael Erlewine up in Big Rapids, Michigan at Matrix Software. Jeff had just moved to San Diego and was vice president of ACS. That was Neil Mickelson. That became the book publishing company. And so he was into book publishing. And I had a conference down that way. We got together and he was saying, hey, you're the guy who knows the internet. a matter of fact, I was hosting an internet conference on dietary supplements on the internet.
Wow.
And this was in the, I guess it must have been in the summer
Mm.
of maybe even in the spring of 1998.
Wow.
Anyhow, and I went and visited Jeff, and I said, "Hey, how you doing?" He goes, "I love San Diego. I hate books. I want to do something on the internet." He goes, "I have an idea," and he told me this idea. And I said, "Well, I have an idea," and I told him my idea. I hadn't even walked into his house yet, and we said, and we looked at each other, and I said, "Let's do it," and I said 50-50. He said 50-50. We shook hands, and then I walked into his house, and
Wow.
that was how Star IQ was born, which was first the first real astrology publishing site. Kind of Astrodienst was in its infancy, but we
Because
had a
really,
slightly
Star IQ was quite pioneering in that it was one of the first serious astrology
yeah
websites. Is that
yeah
right?
yeah basically we had big ideas,
Mm.
and we had good financing, and we rode the .com.bomb ride from 1990, late 98 through the spring of 2001,
Mm.
when the internet fell apart, and everyone bankrupted, and we just took Star IQ home, so to speak.
Mm.
At our height, we had 17 full-time employees. It was costing us a little bit over $50,000 a month just
Wow.
to, to keep the ball rolling. And we had our site set and had negotiated business arrangements with NBC. Their company then was NBCI, NBC Interactive. And it was like definitely playing in the big leagues for a while.
Mm.
We hired Llewellyn's production editor, senior production editor, and we were publishing, if I remember correctly, we were publishing in the range of about 40 fresh articles a month.
Wow.
And those articles were written by people like Eric Francis, like Ronnie Gale Dreyer, Nick Dagan Best, like Ray Merriman was writing a daily financial update for us.
Wow.
And a weekly that he would have to us every day within a half an hour of market close, and we would have it on the site within an hour. I mean,
Wow.
it was a major production, deal. We were also publishing a weekly column by Rob Hand, that was original Rob Hand. I mean, and I came up with the name for Star IQ. I'm kind of this name geek. I came up with the name of Rob's column, which he told me, he said, "Rick, I would never write a column with this name, except somehow this works and I'll do it for you." And the name of this weekly column was Astrology by Hand.
Oh, astrology.
That was the column.
Incredible.
But and those, I don't know how many weeks there were, maybe 40 weeks that we did them. Those are all on Astrodienst now. I basically gave them to Alois so that, because I thought the material, was too good not to be available. So those columns are all available on astro.com.
Wonderful.
But we had an idea. I had an idea then, and Jeff had an idea. Jeff's idea was to publish high level astrology in a format that people can understand it with rudimentary knowledge of astrology. And we published articles that were timely on Academy Awards, on news story. Matter of fact, Michael Wolfstar wrote a weekly column for us called Newscope. That was basically the astrology of major events of the past week, once a week, every week. We had days that on Thursdays was, Newscope. We had entertainment day, we had sports, we had all these different categories, and we had writers writing things about these different real-time events so that it was actually a site that had relevance in the day for the day, but it was all with an astrological twist that now you could find by tuning on to any one of 100 different threads on Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, but none of that was available then. None of that was available.
And of course, and all you again were the pioneers really in this, even commercial space, as you were doing and being connected with Barnes and Noble, and it became more commercial. So for someone who liked to push the boundaries, were there any commercial barriers in a sense? I don't know if that question makes sense, but were there any limitations on getting such publications so widely spread across the world, or anything along those lines?
Well, yes and no. I mean, we had a bit of a sales pitch, for our investors who were not necessarily astrologers. We had Seattle at that time was rocking out on the internet. Remember, Seattle at that time was the home of this brand new company called Amazon. And I think that stariq.com, Inc. might have been the first company to incorporate with the name .com in their corporation name.
Wow.
That was like, I had to argue with a number of people, including the attorneys. And we had, our attorneys were high level. Their clients were the top level internet properties at the time. I would be embarrassed to tell you how much money we spent, on accountants and attorneys, because we did all this right. With the exception that we were way over leveraged. And when the market fell apart, all of a sudden Microsoft stock dropped 50%, and several $1 million in second round financing just disappeared before we were able to ink any deals, because the bottom fell out of the internet, and NASDAQ for that matter. Nevertheless, in its heyday, stariq.com was the shits. It was the thing. It was, it was amazing. And like I said, we had 17 full-time people doing editorial graphics, contract work, for our writers. We were paying people well, and we had a formula. And it's just, it's like, Jeff is an Aries rising and I'm a stellium in Aries, and we got it up, but we just couldn't keep it up.
so
in light of the business environment around us.
Fascinating. And speaking of pioneering, you have, even to this day, followed the changes in, as you've alluded to before, with social media, these new forms of technology. You have an incredible YouTube channel, which I love. I can't wait to watch every month and mid-month. And so you've navigated these waters through all these technologies, and you're successfully doing it today. How have you come about that? Have you just always been ahead of the game, or what's the...
So put a Gemini rising, Uranus in Gemini in the first house, with an Aquarius midheaven, and a tight Sun, Mercury, Venus, Mars conjunction in mid-Aries in the 11th house, with the North Node in the 11th house, and have that Aries stellium trine Pluto in the 3rd house, with the Gemini rising at the midpoint of the Pluto and Leo Aries stellium trine, and you put it all together and it spells mother. Oh, no, that's my Cancer moon. That spells mother. But I've always been a bit of a techno geek. I had my first computer in 1977 when it was still a hobbyist thing. And I still, to this day, probably spend more money on leading edge or bleeding edge technology. When something new comes out, I want it, whether it's a computer or sound equipment, or camera, or software. It's always been my thing. And so in a way, the social media thing really was just part and parcel of what I was doing. Jeff and I, going back a little bit when Star IQ kind of crashed and burned in 2001, 2. I mean, we kept it alive. Star IQ it's still up, but I call stariq.com Jupiter, meaning it's a star that never made it. It didn't quite reach, burn, and so it just settled back. And so Star IQ is like a faint shadow of what it once was. I keep it, up and running, but there's just nothing on it compared to what used to be there. I just can't pull the plug on it. I just, for whatever reason. But what happened was that I guess it must have been 2005, we got an invitation from Barnes and Noble, who was producing an annual Your Astrology Guide book. And their current author had not delivered, and they were panicking because they were going to miss a year. Wow. And they flew us out. I think it must have been like August, maybe, of 2005. And they said, is it possible? We understand you guys are good writers. We've seen your writing on the Star IQ site. We know about you. Can you turn a book, or how fast can you turn a book around? Because we need a 2006 Your Astrology Guide on the book stands by Thanksgiving, or we will miss our opportunity. This was August.
Wow.
So we said yes. And they paid us a nice advance for just saying yes. Well, half up front and half when the book was delivered. And we basically went back, and in 1 week back and forth with Barnes and Noble's editor, we came up with a format, because we didn't want to write just a sun sign book that didn't have real astrology. And so we developed a kind of, how do you deliver real astrology, which we were kind of doing at Star IQ. We had a sense of that there is a wider audience. And so we created a formula for the book. They said, go. And in 7 weeks, we turned around a 150,000 word book.
Wow.
Now, I was writing dailies, 1,200 words a day, 7 days a week on top of the book.
That's incredible.
I don't ever want to do that again. But the book did come out, Your Astrology Guide, 2006. And Jeff and I wrote 2006, 2007, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, and 13. And by 8 years of that, Jeff and I both said, we don't ever want to do this again. Too much work and again, we were being paid pretty well for what we were doing. But it's a book that had a shelf life not much longer than my dailies. And again, it's interesting, being a Uranus rising, Aries stellium, most of the somewhere around 4.5 million words that I've written from 2001 to 2020 have a shelf life of a Tibetan sand painting. I mean, in other words, they're in someone's screen for 3 minutes, they read them and they delete them, and that's it. There's no longevity at all.
And again, it's incredible how many people you've reached, millions of people, and some of that mutability that you like to change with the times, and that cardinal energy of initiating, and it's just really remarkable all that you've done, and with such gusto as well.
But what that's allowed me to do is that, because I'm not writing daily now, I've been able to put my effort into some other things, including another course for the Astrology Hub. And I mean, my fundamentals of astrology, levels 1 and 2 on the Astrology Hub, both had over somewhere in the range of 2,000 students or more.
Wow.
My current one, which is a lot more technical on The Magic of Harmonic Aspects, still have well over 700 students in that course.
Incredible. And talking about circling back to that, I'd love to talk to you about the harmonics work and what you've been doing. So how did that come about? Was that an evolution over time? Is it something that you've
Well,
been...
yes and no. Let me just finish this thought though on because I'm not writing dailies now, I've been able to, for the first time in 20 years, get back to a book that I published almost 30 years ago as a collection of essays that's now being rewritten into a real book. It's my life work, which is really kind of partly tied into this harmonics work.
Wow.
And the name of the book, its working name is Quantum Astrology, The Physics of Metaphysics.
Wonderful.
And the subtitle is Theory and Practice. It's really the theory and practice of quantum astrology. Because the two pieces, theory and practice, are very separate, but they totally interweave. And this goes back to my strong science base, as you know, not only academically, but I've probably read more science material since I graduated college in the early 70s than many read when they're taking an academic degree. And I've been blessed because I have some very, very well-known, widely published in multiple language theoretical physicists who have actually read my work and corrected it and said, this is really intriguing. This is not correct. You need to go back and read Werner Heisenberg so that you understand what he's saying. You're not quite getting it. Okay. So I know my physics is good.
Yeah.
And so that really for me began with a collection of essays that I wrote for a magazine called Aspects Magazine, which was really the Aquarian Workshops, which was Angel Thompson and Marion March. It was the Southern California group. And I wrote, it was a quarterly publication. And for about 3 years, I wrote an essay or a column called Quantum Astrology.
Wow.
And it was the interface of quantum physics and astrology. And it's really that work and those columns which has more than anything influenced and set the body of my real work. Because again, I have the part of me that wrote daily columns that had very little astrology in it. And I mean, I wrote for 12 signs every day and a little overview. And the people reading it were maybe fed a little bit more than they might get from a typical astrology column, but it wasn't
a gateway or a gateway drug that I've heard you say before. Yeah.
Well, actually, that's Chris Brennan's great line that sun sign right? astrology is a gateway drug, for horoscopic astrology. And so, from that standpoint, I'm definitely a metaphysical drug dealer. But what's intriguing is that I've always done this 1 foot here, 1 foot there thing. And although I love the explaining astrology to people who don't have a clue and don't get it, whether they're religiously impaired or scientifically impaired, that's on one end of the spectrum. On the other end of the spectrum, I can totally geek out. I mean, give me some harmonic arc transformations and, and I'm in, because the technical side of astrology to me is, it pushes the theoretical mathematician. And ultimately, I should say that going to college 50 years ago to become a geometry teacher, that's what I am. I'm a geometry teacher. Sacred geometry. It's how geometry impacts your consciousness.
Incredible. And how you've merged all these interests and all your reading together. And even going back to your interest in music and talking about harmonics, I've heard you say, talking about astrology, that astrology is music. And in our back and forth on our emails, you actually sent me a wonderful chart that you did with Mozart, with all the different minor aspects and the septiles and the quintiles. And
no minor.
Sorry, no, minor, no, sure.
That's why I have Chris Brennan to thank for this, because Chris and I went round and round. I did a podcast a year ago or maybe 2 years ago, I don't remember. And he wanted basically a podcast on minor aspects.
I'm sorry for saying minor. I was actually going to ask you because you don't like the term minor aspect. That's what I was leading to. So I apologize for bringing up the
and it's certainly a pet peeve. And although I can understand Chris's perspective that you can take minor as major and minor, like in music, a minor key is not less important than a major key. It's more mysterious. But when people say, no, that's a major aspect and this is only a minor aspect, it makes them less important. And so Chris and I,
it's the terminology of minor. It's not lesser than. That's the major issue.
I would no sooner do a client chart without quintiles and septiles than I would without trines or without Mars. That's how important they are.
Right.
I mean, one could do a chart without trines and probably get by. One could do a chart without Mars. There's a story that Mark Robertson once did a class in front of at a conference, and he did the chart of then Cassius Clay, Muhammad Ali, and he did it without Mars in it, and it was the end of the class before someone realized there was no Mars in his chart.
Wow.
You know, it's holographic. Things fill in. You know, it's and we can do a chart with just the sun and the moon. You know, it's not going to be as detailed oriented, but the point is that there's nothing minor about the harmonic aspects. They're just non-zodiacal. And so Chris and I went round and round on it, and I begged him not to call the podcast, which is up there. It's one of his most watched podcasts. But I begged him, don't call this minor aspects with Rick Levine. Call it non-zodiacal aspects. Call it something else, but not minor. And he said, he thought about it and he got back to me. He goes, I just want to give you a heads up. I'm calling it minor because that's what people know it by. And I said, okay, you know, it's your program and we've already recorded it, and okay. But it was then that I realized I needed a better name than non-Ptolemaic aspects or non-zodiacal aspects. And the bottom line is this: all aspects are harmonic, but not all harmonic aspects are traditional astrological aspects. So, for example, when you play a musical note, and I like to say to people that I'm an astrologer in the lineage of Pythagoras and Kepler, both of whom contributed a huge amount to our understanding of sound and music and scales. And both Pythagoras and Kepler referred to what they each called the music of the spheres. And of course, that's been kind of poo-pooed because music isn't conductible in a vacuum. However, electromagnetic vibrations are. And electromagnetic vibrations, although they're not pressure like we hear sound waves on our eardrums, and we hear sound waves in the range of tens of cycles a second up to tens of thousands of cycles a second. But the key thing is that we measure sound waves in cycles per second. Scientists measure electromagnetic waves in cycles per second, but they're more than just 10 or 20 cycles a second. Well, through our walls, that's 60 cycles a second or 50 cycles a second in some places. But when you turn on a computer, your computer is alternating at 4 trillion cycles a second, 4 gigahertz. A hertz is 1 cycle a second. And an FM radio is like 93.7 million cycles a second.
Wow.
90.3, whatever, megahertz, million cycles a second. An AM radio is thousands of cycles a second. Like 570 AM is 570 kilohertz, or
Wow.
570,000 cycles a second.
Mm.
The problem with the music of the spheres is that it's outside the range of scientific instrumentation, because instead of cycles per second, they're cycles per year or century or millennium.
Mm.
Pluto is 4 cycles a millennium. How many cycles is that a second? How many hertz is that? It's 0.000000001, blah, 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 blah. That's how many, cycles per second it is.
Mm.
How many cycles per second is the moon? It's 13 cycles a year.
Mm.
So I've introduced a term called a unit of measure called the Kepler.
Wow.
The Kepler is 1 cycle per year.
That's such a fascinating perspective. And does that as well stem? I've heard you talked about your early years with radios and talking about frequencies. I think, does that stem from a long life and journey and putting these together?
It stems from the fact that my father was a vacuum tube. My father was an amateur radio operator who collected vacuum tubes and would find a vacuum tube and go, oh, this one's interesting, and set it on his desk. And 2 months later, he'd start sketching schematics. And a few months later, he would have a 75-meter single sideband transceiver made with that vacuum tube. And so my dad was an engineer, a radio engineer, who wound coils. I grew up around machines that made coils and Tesla coils and radio, variable condensers, which are like coils interfacing with one another. Wow. So that was my childhood. My dad always had a workroom where it looked like he was a spy with blinking lights and dials and vacuum tubes and whatever. And so, yeah, the metaphor of radios, I think, is very important because I am firmly convinced that what we see as planets are half of the picture. Like when we look inside an atom, and, no one has ever seen an electron. I don't know if you know that. What we see are clouds of electron possibilities. This is quantum weirdness. No one's ever seen an electron. You see the potential of where an electron might be as a cloud. But the thing about that, and this was Werner Heisenberg's Nobel Prize, I think 1930 something. He won. My camera seems to have gone out of focus. Or is it me? I don't know. That Werner Heisenberg realized that the more we know about where an electron is, the less we know about its trajectory, where it's going. This is called the particle-wave duality. Light travels as a wave, but when you measure it, it's a photon. It's a particle. This camera is making me crazy. So basically, what Heisenberg demonstrated is that the more you know about the particle at the subatomic level, the less you know about the wave. The more you know about the wave, you less know about the particle. You can't know both at once. If you look at a light wave, the moment you measure it, the wave becomes a particle. But when you stop looking at it, it travels like a wave again. The particle-wave duality.
Wow. And I'm not qualified to speak about this topic, but what I've read about quantum mechanics, isn't there an experiment where the effect of what happens depends on whether it's being observed or not?
Yeah, it's called the double slit experiment. And in fact, you can go into YouTube and do a YouTube search on double slit experiment or double slit, and then go Fred Alan Wolf or Dr. Quantum. And Fred Wolf is a longtime friend, associate of mine. And he's done this caricature thing of this character called Dr. Quantum, who actually shows this double slit experiment that shows that when you shoot light two slits, they make interference patterns on the wall that look like surf, that look like waves. But when you measure them, they shoot through like little BB guns, like particles that don't mesh like waves at all. Particle wave duality. So here's the question. Are planets particles or waves? Astrologers use planets as particles. I remember having this conversation with Rob Hand probably more than 20 years ago, and telling him this idea of, of mine, of the quantum particle wave duality that's at the microcosm, and how that exists on the macrocosm also. And I said, when we look at a chart, what we're looking at is we're looking at particles. Saturn is a particle. The moon is a particle. The sun is a particle. I call them BFPs. Big fucking particles.
I like that. Your corner phrases are fantastic.
But these BFPs are particles. However, when you're not looking at the moon, which right now I think is a particle that we can map in Aries, if I'm not looking at it, the moon is traveling at a 13 cycle per year waveform. It's getting larger in light, and it's waxing and waning, and it's a wave. But when I look at it, it's a particle. And when I construct a chart, I'm particularizing the quantum wave function, which is, they sometimes call that popping the quantum wave function, turning the waves of indeterminacy into particles.
Wow.
That's what we do as astrologers. And I remember Rob telling me, well, that's kind of true, but when we do transits, we look at waves. And I said, well, that's almost true, because with transits, we look at waves, but what we're interested is, when does transiting Saturn conjoin my natal sun? When do these two particles collide? That is the popping of that's the particularization. Yes, they travel as waves, but as astrologers, we're focused on the event. We're focused on the particle. And this is one of the lessons that I learned from Grant Louis about his work with Saturn, in looking at the larger wave cycles of Saturn. And I think that astrologers would gain a lot by backing up from planets as particles and understanding them as ongoing waves. That if you have Saturn, let's say, in the sky, let's say that you're a moon in Pisces, and you have Saturn coming up to conjoining your natal moon in Pisces, I'm less interested that Saturn will conjoin that natal moon at the end of March of 2023 than I am concerned about what happened when Saturn was at 0 or 1 degree of Sagittarius, and what about when it was at 0, 1 degree of Virgo, and what about when it was conjoined 29 years ago? Because once we're born, we get waves of the same experience, as long as we're on Saturn, from Saturn about every 7.5 years, as Saturn makes a quadrature, a fourth harmonic. A conjunction square, opposition square is a cycle divided by 4. That's a fourth harmonic. Don't tell me you don't use harmonics if you use squares, because a square is a fourth harmonic. You just language it differently. A trine is a circle divided by 3. It's a third harmonic. You use harmonics, you just language it differently. Point being that Saturn conjoining your natal moon in March of 2023 is not a singular event. It's a point on a trajectory that has been activated at every quadrature, every conjunction square, opposition square, conjunction square, since you were born. Make the map of all those points, and now tell me the story. Don't pull out a particular event. And where this all ends up is at a punchline that I won an award in Kolkata, India, several years ago. I was one of about 40 Western astrologers lecturing at this conference, and there were also many local Vedic astrologers lecturing there. And I didn't even realize that there was a competition, but they gave an award for the best. It was like a TED conference. Everyone had 25 minutes to do their talk. That was it. Doesn't matter where you flew in from, you had 25 minutes to do your talk.
Wow.
And my talk was a quantum look at fate and free will.
In 25 minutes?
In 25 minutes. I just did it for you. I've just done the whole lead up for you. Wow. Because the quantum perspective of particle and wave, Heisenberg's uncertainty principle, basically morphs into Levine's uncertainty principle, which is this. The more you know about fate at any given moment, the less you know about free will, and vice versa. Heisenberg said the more you know about where a particle is, the less you know about where it's going. I would say the more you know about free will, the less you know about fate. It's particle and wave. Wow. Particle are these BFPs where we're popping the quantum wave function and we're making a prediction. We're talking about an event. We're being specific in a moment. And then the waveform is the field of quantum indeterminacy that unfolds through time as a wave, but particularizes at moments in time when there are, let's call them planetary collisions, for lack of a better word. So the formula is fate is to particle as free will is to wave.
Wow.
And that won me the International Astrologer of the Year award, which is a trophy that was too big to carry home, but I did. And a crown with rubies and diamonds on it that's still in India because I can't afford the tariff on getting it out of India.
To bring it back over. Wow. You literally blow my mind. I'm gonna have to rewatch this several times. Where it comes from is mind blowing. Your perspectives and the way how eloquently you put things together as well is so unique.
Thank you.
And
Thank you. Yeah. Well, and it is what I'm talking about is leaking into the zeitgeist, but it's not. I mean, I sometimes, Gemini rising, I feel like I've stolen the best ideas from everyone, but I've taken them and pushed them all a notch further. And a lot of my ideas are my ideas, but I mean, even with some of these harmonic aspects, I coined the term almost 40 years ago, called a golden yod, which I see in print now all over the place as if that was its name.
Incredible.
And I don't think anyone knows where it came from. I know where it came from because I made it up. And I know why I made it up is because if you take a yod, which is a 12th harmonic aspect, because it's 5/12, 5/12, and a sextile 2/12. And if you take the sextile base and you widen that 60 degrees to 72 degrees, then the 150 degree quincunx sides narrow to 144 degrees, making a quintile, biquintile, biquintile, which is 3 points on a 5-pointed star. And the only way to create the golden mean, the divine proportion, the magical number that was the basis of the book and movie, The Da Vinci Code, the ratio that Johannes Kepler said God uses to create like from like.
Wow.
That golden mean can only be made geometrically. And the Greeks knew this, and they did this by creating a 5-pointed star, because the diagonals of a 5-pointed star intersect each other in the golden mean proportion. So I basically realized that if the yod is a 12th harmonic aspect, and in physics, the lower the harmonic, the stronger the waveform. In other words, if you play a note on a piano and let's say it's A below middle C at 220 cycles a second, boom, you play that note, what you're hearing is not just that note, you're hearing harmonics, overtones at the same time. And some of those overtones might be uncomfortable, and that's what makes a brass note sound brassy off a trombone, let's say. And yet on a flute, that same note sounds so smooth, or a violin, but it's the same note, but the harmonics are different. And so when we look at an aspect that's based upon 1/5 of a circle, the fifth harmonic is louder, basser, stronger than the 12th harmonic. Just like the octave is the second harmonic in music, that's going to be stronger than other harmonics, because the lower the harmonic, conjunction is a first harmonic, opposition second, trine third, square fourth. Astrologers then jump to sixth, to the sextile. But the fact of the matter is that the fifth harmonic is stronger than the sixth, and it's certainly stronger than the 7th, 8th, 9th, 10th, 11th, or 12th. And so if you have a configuration that are 3 points on a 5-pointed star, meaning like a yod that has been fattened into 3 points on a 5-pointed star, that's going to be more resonant than what we call a yod, or what I call a quincunx yod, or a sextile yod, or a 12th harmonic yod. And yet the reason why astrologers don't know that is that astrology was written by guys for guys, and it's based upon material reality. That the number 12 is great because it divides by 3 and 4, and 4 is the natural structure of the material world. It's why the cross is the symbol of the Catholic Church. In the Catholic Church, there is no symbol for nothingness. In fact, that's why they fought Arabic numbers. They were from the infidels, because there was this thing called the cipher, which meant nothing. And Roman numerals doesn't have a symbol for nothing, because the Catholic Church is based upon the idea that there is no such thing as nothing, that's reserved for God. That's the divine proportion. And we live in a material world. And so therefore, it's my contention that this 3 points on a 5-pointed star yod should be called a golden yod, because it's based upon the golden mean. Seemed like a no-brainer to me, but I know people now call that a golden yod, and they have no idea.
I do, and I see the term everywhere. And again, you just blow my mind. And talking about a lasting impact with names you've come up with, not only your work, but am I right in believing that KeplerCollege, who I'm with now, you named the college? Is that correct?
Guilty as charged.
Incredible.
So I was at that first meeting with Maggie Nalbandian and Laura Nalbandian and Jeff Green and Michael Muncasey and Stephen James and Roxana Muse and Gary Lawrenson and a bunch of other very brilliant astrologers and movers and shakers. And we're just talking about, is it even possible to make an academic institution? And I was excited about it. And as you may know, KeplerCollege did not go in the way that I, in my mind, had imagined it. And in fact, I was at that time so involved in the startup of StarIQ.com that I was hoping that StarIQ would be so crazy successful that we would just be able to fund this college. I mean, just boomed. I mean, that was my dream. Obviously, it didn't happen. Sure. But at that first meeting, I said, if this is a possibility, and if we are able to make a real college, an accredited academic institution built around the ideas of astrology, since astrology was basically segregated from the academic world by the age of enlightenment, which I love that Rob Hand calls it the age of endarkenment. But that if this was feasible, that the name would be really important, and we should create a name that in some way was an in-your-face Trojan horse that brought something into public. I said, like, for example, most modern scientists think Johannes Kepler was the father of modern astronomy. And like a lot of ignorant, superstitious people of his time, he did astrology, but he didn't really believe in it because he was really a scientist. and nothing could be further from the truth. You know, we have copies of his own chart in his own hand. I mean, he was the timekeeper for Emperor Rudolph, the Holy Roman Empire emperor. And the reason why he discovered the laws of planetary motion was because he needed exact and accurate measurements, which didn't exist. And so the Rudolphine tables created by Kepler, when he recalculated the orbit of Mars, and he said, I have touched mountains, and it is tremendous what they belch forth. I have robbed the ancient sacred crypts of Egypt, you know, for this truth. I mean, Kepler was an astrology freak. And of course, as you may know, Kepler also was the first person to mess with the Ptolemaic aspects. Kepler introduced the quintile, and he also introduced the semi-square and sesqui-square, which were not aspects until he made them up, because he was a mathematician extraordinaire. And again, this is why I use the word harmonic aspects, because Kepler introduced the first non-zodiacal aspects, because when you divide 12 by 1, 2, 3, 4, 6, or 12, it's even. Conjunction, opposition, trine, square, sextile, semi-sextile, or quincunx. But when you divide it by 5, 7, 8, 9, 10, or 11, these are non-zodiacal. But the lower the harmonic, the more resonant the vibration, which means that a quintile is going to be more resonant than a sextile.
Wow.
It means a septile is going to be more resonant than a quincunx. In fact, it means that an 11-tile, sometimes called an undecile, I call them 11 tiles or elf tiles. Elf is German for 11. The elf tiles, which are 32 and I mean, they don't come out zodiacal or even decimal, but an 11 tile is going to be a louder vibration than a semi-sextile, because it's an 11th harmonic, which is lower harmonic, louder than a 12th harmonic. And so astrologers don't get this. And as long as they don't get it, they're missing out on the magic of all those things that are not three-dimensional. Because if you want 3 dimensions, not only go conjunction, square, opposition, but take a half a square and a half of a square, and you come up with the whole German school of, you know, of 90-degree wheel and, you know, Uranian astrology, and cosmobiology, that is. And the 90-degree wheel will show you, which is the 4th harmonic, will show you real world events. But people of our day and age understand that not everything that's real occurs in the 3-dimensional world. And not everything that occurs in the 3-dimensional world is more important than things that occur outside of the 3-dimensional world. Where is this conversation happening? It's not happening in the realm of squares or the material world. It's happening on electromagnetic frequencies. And so the world we live in today as astrologers is different than the world that our ancestors lived in. And in fact, it is my strong contention, one of my favorite lecture topics. I'm giving this talk on the Azore Islands next month at the Portuguese Astrology Society conference. It's basically on the disintegration of Saturn.
Wow.
In other words, Saturn is not what it used to be. Saturn used to be the period at the end of the book. Saturn was finality. Saturn was the limit. You couldn't get any more whatever it was than Saturn, because after Saturn, there was nothing.
Right.
And in fact, in the English language, the symbol for Saturn backwards, which looks like a backwards ST in the English or in all the Romantic Indo-European languages, the ST is still a symbol for Saturn. Tell me your favorite Saturn words: austerity, restriction, stability, stamina, tests, crystallization, all the stuff. And how do you make a limit on any word? You just throw an ST on the end of it. Big, bigger, biggest. This st is the limit of Saturn. That's it. It's the end of the road. Can't get any happier than happiest. That's the Saturn thing.
Mm,
You want to make things in order, you go the first and the last. You have things in order.
mm.
And you have structure, you have statutes of state, the words. And what language is perhaps the most Saturnian culture in the entire world? It's a language built with stus and stus. It's German. I
Mm,
mean, that's,
mm.
and then you go to the Asian languages. There is no Saturn. There is no. It's all Hawaii, and I'm not making fun of it. I don't speak
Yeah,
those
different way.
languages,
Yeah, yeah.
but there's no. There's it's missing the external authority structure of Saturn.
Right, right.
So the thing is that as we discovered Uranus, Neptune, Pluto, and about 500,000 other things that go around the sun that NASA tracks exactly,
Mm.
Saturn just doesn't have the same staying power that it
Mm,
used to have.
mm.
And it used to be that Saturn was the end of the road. Saturn was the Grim Reaper. Saturn was, karma. You get what you deserve, and that's it. It's you're dead. You're dead. Boom. Now we know. No, dying is like walking from one room to another, and that consciousness doesn't need a physical body to exist,
Mm.
and that Uranus, Neptune, Pluto, and Eris and Makemake and a pile of other things and centaurs and asteroids and objects. Basically, there's a lot more out there than the material world.
It's quite interesting you're bringing up Saturn, and we go back to your early experiences that you must maybe in some way thought, this is not finality, this is not convention that I'm interested in. I want to push the bound. You're going beyond Saturn. I just think that's quite interesting. I don't know if that makes sense, but
well, it didn't until I took my first acid trip. No, I mean, plant medicine and it doesn't even have to be that. It can be various forms of pranayama, of kundalini, of breathing, of meditation, of yoga, but certainly plant medicine and or LSD as catalyst is certainly a way of shattering the illusion of the reality or the predominance or the ultimacy of the three-dimensional world.
And of course,
that's
now
why
using
harmonic
psychedelics
aspects.
in therapy, and
Sorry, go ahead.
So they're now using psychedelics in therapy with folks with PTSD. All these
now using it. I used it. I
in
used it in therapy in 1969 with Tim Leary and Ram Dass as my therapists.
This is one of the best conversations I've ever had. Absolutely brilliant. So I know your time's precious. I've just got a couple more questions for you. So one of the questions I'd like to ask, as what you've seen through all your experiences and through the decades, where do you see astrology heading from where we are today in the next 20, 40, or 100 years? Do you have any thoughts about where we're going?
Yeah, I have a lot of thoughts. You got an hour or three?
For you, yes.
Well, first of all, I am of the belief that someday around the corner, as if there are corners in the future, someday around the bend, that a group of researchers, graduate students in theoretical physics at MIT or Stanford are going to announce that they've discovered a solution to Einstein's missing unified field theory, and that planets are actually ultra, very, 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 very low frequency electromagnetic radiation that's on the exact same spectrum as cosmic waves, X-rays, light energy, radio waves, power distribution, that planet waves are just way octaves lower, and that these waves are actually transmittable, and that in some ways they inform our biology by a harmonic resonance, but they will tell us this has nothing to do with the superstition of astrology.
That sounds about right.
So that's one potential prediction for the future. On the other hand, we have a world of intelligent people who have the ability to go online and finding things like Astrology University, what Tony Howard's doing, things like the Astrology Hub and the enormously competent astrologers that Amanda Pua Walsh has put together there, things like KeplerCollege, where there is a condensation of academic excellence. And although in my mind, KeplerCollege would have been more of a synthesis of postmodern theoretical physics and postmodern Jungian psychology mixed with planetary mechanics. And instead, it's a bit of a craft school, a trade school, and I'm not making less of it. It's found a place, and I'm thrilled that it's still around. But, remember, Kepler, again, looking at the logo of KeplerCollege, which actually came off the pen of Stephen James based upon conversations of Johannes Kepler's Mysterium.
I wondered where the symbol came from. I wondered who was involved.
Well, it basically came from Kepler's book Mysterium Cosmographicum, which was Mysteries of the Cosmos, in which he tried to fit the planets into circumscribed, there's a difference, into circumscribed platonic solids, the triangle inside the pentagram, inside the circle, inside the square, inside another. And the mechanics didn't quite work out perfectly, but Kepler kind of forced it to. And that that image of KeplerCollege, it's up over you. Yeah, you're pointing to it now. That basically is based upon Kepler's sacred geometry, of these circumscribed platonic solids. And so the point here is that Kepler certainly has found a place in the real world, but it's never quite fulfilled its image that I thought was potential, at least in my mind. There's also the work of someone like Nassim Haramein, a theoretical physicist who has this thing called the Resonance Foundation. This stuff exists out there as a body of knowledge, as does astrology, as if they are two separate things. They are one and the same thing. They are part of the same thing. The work of Buckminster Fuller and the mathematics of triangulation and the creation of a hexagon that's triangulated, that's the basic structure of the invisible energy, that's the lattice of space-time, is absolutely overwhelmingly important. It helps us understand how the equilibrium of a trine or triangle, grand trine, and or sextile, a half of a trine, is so important. And when you take out a leg of a hexagon, it basically warps that and makes it into a non-planar thing. It gives it 3 dimensions or curved space, and this is why the quintiles are so important. And Buckminster Fuller knew this, and Nassim Haramein and other people doing that work in physics of the spatial creation of the theoretical physics landscape know this also. But somehow you don't find any advanced physicists talking about how that works with astrology. Well, there are some floating around out there, and I'm in touch with several of these people. But the point here is that this is part of the future of astrology. When we begin to understand that the organs of the body are like in a sound system, for example, or in a computer, that there's a thing called band pass filters that basically allow certain frequencies to come through, and then they magnify those frequencies, and others are shunted aside or set as beat frequencies against something else. Integrated circuit analysis is what an electronics engineer would do to build a vacuum tube radio or a computer. How is all this made? It's all made with high frequencies, fluctuating and beating against other high frequencies. Well, I believe that we will discover that the reason why kidneys relate to Libra has something to do with the frequency of Venus as it beats its golden mean proportion to Earth. Here's something that's interesting. Venus is the planet of beauty, right? Mm-hmm. Love, aesthetic perfection, pleasure. Well, the golden mean in the Leonardo da Vinci and even in the Greek archetypes is the ratio of beauty, aesthetic perfection. It's associated with the rose, with the five-pointed star and the rose. And Venus takes 224.7 days to go around the sun once. The Earth takes 365.24 days to go around the sun once. 365.24 divided by 224.7 equals 1.62, which is the golden mean. Venus is the golden mean musically, beating its harmony to Earth. And so I mean, there are a few people who know this, but most astrologers don't. They don't know why Venus is the planet associated with beauty. The planets archetypally hum what they are. And so I think the future of astrology will go in this direction. David Cochran, who is basically 2.5 weeks younger than me, is my Aries stellium in Taurus. We are doing very similar work. And what I call quantum astrology and the particle wave duality and using harmonic aspects is kind of like another gateway drug to his vibrational astrology, which throws out the natal chart as Kepler wanted to do and look at the music, at the harmony based upon the various powers of the microscope, except it's not a microscope, it's a radioscope, if you will. It's that bandpass filter that's tuning in the 7th harmonic by magnifying every point in the chart times 7, so that you don't only see the septiles as conjunctions, but you see the half septiles and the septiles and a half and so on as oppositions. And you see the quarter septiles and the 3/4 septiles as squares. And all of a sudden you have an ability to fine tune the harmonic frequencies in ways that traditional astrology doesn't have a clue. And let me just say, I was an early supporter of, Rob Hand, Bob Schmidt, and Bob Zoller, Project Hindsight. I think that the recovery and the translation work of stuff from Aramaic, from Sanskrit, from Greek, from Latin, from Hebrew, unbelievably important. But I don't think we live 2,000 years ago. And I think that people who practice Hellenistic astrology as if it was astrology are missing something, just as I think people who are practicing harmonic analysis without understanding the ancient systems of dignity and so on are missing something also. That it's about a synthesis of the old and the new. But we don't live in that world anymore.
We live in this culture. We do not live in a
world. We do not live in a world that's limited to a division by 12. I've had this argument or debate with many traditionalists, including Rob Hand, over the years.
Sure.
And there are many people who believe that 12 is absolutely is an absolute fundamental necessity to make astrology work. And I don't think so. It works. It makes the system that we call astrology work.
Right.
But there are not 12 signs up there. I make every student of mine repeat after me. How many signs up there are there on the zodiac? No, there are not 12 signs up there. There are 12 signs up here. We made that shit up. Doesn't mean that we didn't make it up well, and it doesn't mean that it's not amazingly useful. But there is not a division by 12 up there. There's a division of 12 in here because 12 is such a powerful number from a conceptual point of view, especially when we're dividing things by half and half and half again, because that's the way the logical mind, kind of creates ratio or understands things. Anyhow, that's it.
Thank you so much. Again, you blow my mind. I'm going to have to keep rewatching this just to keep up with your, again, I think genius is bantered around a lot, but I would definitely say your genius is just, again, it just blows my mind. And your philosophies and the way you put things together is just, again, so original, so unique. And so
okay, two quick things of what I'm up to right now, aside from writing the book.
Yeah, this
Quantum
is
Astrology.
leading into my last question. I was going to say, so what is Rick Levine doing now, and what's going on? What's going on with you?
I'm sometimes an easy interviewee and sometimes impossible because I'll answer the questions without waiting.
Anyway, you take it away.
I am doing quite a bit of writing. Quantum astrology is high on my list, but I'm also working on a collection over the years during the COVID quarantine period. I did near weekly interviews for a couple of years on Astrology Hub, and the best of those, called The Cosmic Connection, are being edited into a book called The Best of the Cosmic Connection. That's a wide variety of topics, of everything from a radical look at reincarnation to uses of astrology, to misuses of astrology, to the particle wave duality, to just a whole bunch of things. So I got these writing projects going. I also have a couple of interesting things going on right now. The most exciting thing on my books is I'm returning to India, and this will be this year, 2023, December 6th through the 16th, a 10-day retreat called Initiation to Astrology. Wow. And it's there'll be mid-range beginners, and there are professionals already enrolled in the course. It's a rock and roll 10 days of experiential end lecture in Goa, India, at an Ayurvedic healing spa where they teach yoga classes in the south part of Goa, right up from the beach. It's a place where I've stayed before, I've taught before. It's an amazing tropical place. We have events scheduled, including going to an organic spice plantation where they grow things like ginger and chocolate and cumin and black pepper and stuff like that.
Sounds wonderful.
And markets and just it'll be a really exciting thing. If you're interested in finding out more about that, go to Heaven and Earth Workshops. That's all one word, heavenandearthworkshops.com, and just find the Goa, India. It's one of their workshops.
And I'll put a link below this video in the description too, if the viewers want to check that out.
And then separate from that, the fundamentals of astrology courses through Astrology Hub. These are all self-paced courses that are they vary from 16 to 20 pre-recorded half-hour to 45-minute long lessons that I wrote the curriculum for. It's my astrology, so to speak, even though there's no such thing as the school of Rick Levine astrology. But these are all available.
It should be with a statue somewhere.
These are all available through the Astrology Hub, astrologyhub.com. Fundamentals, or the current one on the harmonic aspects, is Foundations Level 3, but you don't need to take 1 or 2. And even though the course is in motion already, there's no reason why you can't sign up for it anytime and do it at your own pace. And that's astrologyhub.com/F3 for Foundations Level 3. And other than that, I'm on Facebook and Instagram and Patreon. You mentioned my YouTube channel, for which ESAR awarded me the best astrology YouTube channel at the ESAR conference last fall.
Well deserved.
In fact, I won 2 awards. I also won the most original social media, greatest astrology contribution to social media. And when I was called back up for the second award, my Uranus rising showed, because I totally didn't expect either of them. And I was called up for the second award, and I adjusted the microphone. I leaned into the microphone and I said, "This is bullshit." And I just waited for people to look around and go, "Is that okay that he said that?" And I said, "After the revolution, no one will win 2 awards until everyone has won 1. Thank you. And then I left.
Fantastic.
But my YouTube channel, which you referenced, there is a free monthly video that's basically the astrology of the month ahead, but it's kind of a cross. I mean, it's technical and yet it's educational. It basically has whatever I consider to be the most important things of the month ahead. These are published on the 1st of every month. March will be up by March 1st. They run about an hour long. I don't advertise them. They go on their own. They typically 40 to 100,000 views a month, somewhere in that range.
Wonderful.
But the thing is, I do a lot of other YouTube videos, but they're for my subscribers through Patreon.
Right.
And there are Patreon levels for just $3 a month. You get what you referenced as the mid-month, which occasionally I'll throw out for everyone for free. But for $3 a month, you get a mid-month update, which drills down a bit deeper on what's going on for the middle and the second half of the month. And then there's for $35 a month, you get invited to a chart interpretation webinar once a month. And then I have an apprentice program. I have about 30 students in a apprentice program that's been running about 4.5 years now. And more information on that is Patreon, patreon.com/Rick Levine.
Wonderful.
And that's it. I'm out of here.
Yeah, you're not busy at all. Not busy at all.
Well, I now I got to go record the last module for this Foundations Level 3. I have all the research work. The curriculum is all done. I just need to go record it and then do the video editing. I do all my own video editing. I'm fussy that way.
Fantastic, fantastic. Well, again, I'm so honored and privileged, and thank you so much for generously giving your time today. And this has been, again, one of my favorite interviews and conversations. And again, just thank you so much for all that you do and all that you give to the world.
Well, and thank you for giving me a wide enough platform that we had time to get into some stuff rather than just this is how I got into astrology, and here's my next conference kind of a thing.
This is why we want to do the Leaders in Astrology series, just to flesh out these stories and not just
this is run 2 hours.
Oh, has it really? Okay, that is flown by then.
Yeah, no, this goes into Chris Brennan territory.
Right.
The champion of the 3 to 4 hour interview.
Absolutely. Well, thank you again so much, Rick, and have a wonderful rest of your evening.
Thank you, Callum, and thank you, CeplerCollege, for staying around, and thank you for twisting my arm enough to get me back on the board of directors after all these years. So thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Rick. Goodbye.